everyone. In this session, we will be learning about trigeminal ganglion and trigeminal nerve. The objectives are to learn about trigeminal ganglion, its situation and relation, associated root and branches, the trigeminal nerve, its three divisions, the course and distribution of the maxillary nerve and its branches and the applied aspects. The trigeminal ganglion is a sensory ganglion of 5th cranial nerve. It is also known as the Gazerian ganglion. It is made up of pseudo-unipolar ganglion as seen in the dorsal nerve root ganglia of the spinal nerves. So, we have seen the nerve roots in the spinal nerves, dorsal root ganglion, they are pseudo-unipolar nerves. So, these cells are arranged in the form of T-shaped. The processes of these unipolar cells will be in the form of T-shapes, with the one process arises from the cell body and then divides into central and peripheral processes. This ganglion is crescentic or semilunar shape with its convexity directed anterolaterally. So, the three branches emerges from this convexity. The posterior concavity receives the sensory root of the nerve. Situation: it is situated in the trigeminal impression which is present in the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. The meningeal relations: it occupies the trigeminal cave or the Meckel's cave and surrounded by the pia and the arachnoid matter. It is filled with CSF. So, the ganglion is surrounded by the cerebrospinal fluid and it lies in the depth of 5 cm from the preauricular point. The other relations: it is related superiorly to the superior petrosal sinus and the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli. Inferiorly, it is attached to the motor root, the greater petrosal nerve, the foramen lacerum. Medially, it is related to posterior part of lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, the internal carotid artery with its sympathetic plexus. Laterally, it is related to uncus of temporal lobe, the middle meningeal artery and vein and the nervus spinosum. The associated root and branches: the central processes of the ganglion form the sensory root. The attached to the pons at its junction with the middle cerebellar peduncle. The peripheral processes form the three divisions of the trigeminal nerve. The small motor root is attached to the pons superomedial to the sensory root. It passes under the ganglion from its medial to lateral side and joins the mandibular nerve at the foramen ovale. Arterial supply of the ganglion: it is supplied by the ganglionic branches of internal carotid artery, middle meningeal artery and the accessory meningeal artery. The clinical aspect: the intractable facial pain due to the trigeminal neuralgia or the carcinomatosis may be abolished by injecting alcohol into the ganglion. So, now we will discuss about the trigeminal nerve. So, it is the largest cranial nerve and it is mixed nerve, that is it is having both sensory and the motor component. The upper two divisions, ophthalmic and maxillary divisions, are sensory, whereas the largest branch, that is mandibular branch, is the mixed nerve. The sensory part supplies the skin of the face, mucosa of cranial viscera except base of tongue and pharynx. The motor component supplies the muscles of mastication, the tensor veli palatini, the tensor tympani, anterior belly of digastric and the mylohyoid muscle. The trigeminal nuclei. So, the cranial nerve nuclei means it is a collection of the neurons, that is grey matter that is present in the brainstem that is associated with one or more cranial nerves. So, the trigeminal nuclei includes the sensory nuclei and the motor nuclei. The sensory nuclei also grouped under 3 different types, that is mesencephalic nucleus, which is situated in the central grey matter of the midbrain on each side of the aqueduct. It consists of the cell body of pseudo-unipolar neuron and it relays the proprioception from the muscles of mastication, the extraocular muscles and the facial muscles. The other group of sensory nuclei includes the principal sensory nucleus. It lies in the pons lateral to the motor nucleus. It is the relay station for the touch sensation. The third group of sensory nuclei is the spinal nucleus. It extends from the caudal end of the principal sensory nucleus in pons to second or third spinal segment. It relays the pain and temperature. The motor nucleus, it is located in pons medial to the principal sensory nucleus. It innervates the muscles of mastication and tensor tympani and tensor palatini. It is derived from the first bronchial arch. The course and distribution. Both motor and sensory root are attached ventrally to the junction of the pons and middle cerebellar peduncle. The motor root lies ventromedial to the sensory root. It passes anteriorly in the middle cranial fossa to lie below the tentorium cerebelli in cavum trigeminale. The motor root lies inferior to the sensory root. So, here we can observe the sensory root which is larger, it is lying above the motor root. The sensory root is connected to the posteromedial concave border of the trigeminal ganglion and the convex anterolateral margin of the trigeminal ganglion gives the attachment to the 3 divisions of trigeminal nerve. Those are the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch and the mandibular branch. The ophthalmic nerve, it is the first division and emerges through the superior orbital fissure. It carries the sensory fibers from the structures derived from the frontonasal processes. Maxillary nerve, it emerges through the foramen rotundum and this conveys the afferent fibers from the structures derived from the maxillary processes. And the mandibular nerve, that is the third nerve which is a mixed division having both motor and sensory components. It emerges through the foramen ovale, carries the sensory fibers derived from the mandibular process. So, here we can observe the 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve. The V1 represents the ophthalmic nerve. So, that will be giving a sensory fibers to the structures derived from the frontonasal processes. The V2 represents the maxillary nerve that supplies the afferent fibers from the structures derived from the maxillary process, and V3 represents the mandibular nerve that will be carries the sensory fibers derived from the mandibular processes. So, here it is represented by the different colors to show the area of the distribution of these nerves. So, the first division is the ophthalmic nerve. It enters the lateral wall of cavernous sinus from the cavum trigeminal and runs forward to enter the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. There it divides into three branches, that is frontal nerve, the lacrimal nerve and the nasociliary nerve. So, this nerve supplies the cornea, conjunctiva, upper eyelid, forehead and anterior part of the scalp and the nose. So, this nerve we will discuss in detail along with the orbit. So, in this session we will discuss about the maxillary nerve. The mandibular nerve is already discussed in temporal and infratemporal region. So, now we will learn about the maxillary nerve in this session. So, it is the second division of the trigeminal nerve. It is purely sensory and it supplies the mucous membrane of nasal cavity, palate and nasopharynx. It provides the sensory supply to the skin of the cheek, lateral aspect of the nose, upper lip, upper teeth and maxilla. So, first it emerges from the anterolateral aspect of the trigeminal ganglion and reaches the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. From there it passes through the foramen rotundum and enters the pterygopalatine fossa. From there it enters the groove on the posterior surface of the maxilla and passes through the inferior orbital fissure. So, once it passes through the inferior orbital fissure, then it is named as the infraorbital nerve. So, infraorbital nerve is the continuation of the maxillary nerve in the inferior orbital fissure. Finally, it enters the face through infraorbital foramen. So, diagrammatically we can represent the nerve like this, that is the trigeminal nerve. Its three divisions, that is the ophthalmic division represented in blue color passes through the superior orbital fissure. The mandibular nerve represented in the purple, it passes through the foramen ovale, and the maxillary nerve passes through the foramen rotundum and reaches the pterygopalatine fossa, and from there it enters the infraorbital canal and becomes infraorbital nerve. Finally, it enters the face through the infraorbital foramen and supplies the face. So, the branches, it is given in the middle cranial fossa, in the pterygopalatine fossa and in the infraorbital canal. So, in the middle cranial fossa, it gives meningeal branch that travels along the middle meningeal artery and provides the sensory innervation to cranial dura mater. In pterygopalatine fossa, it gives ganglionic branch to supply the spinopalatine ganglion, the posterior superior alveolar nerve and the zygomatic branches. The ganglionic branches, they arise as two trunks, then join to form a single root within the pterygopalatine ganglion, and it gives the postganglionic secretory fibers to the lacrimal gland via zygomatico-temporal and the lacrimal nerve. And it also gives the orbital branches, palatine branches, pharyngeal branches and the nasal branches. The orbital branch supplies the periosteum of the orbit, the palatine branch supplies the palate, the pharyngeal branch passes through the pharyngeal canal and distributed to the mucous membrane of the nasal part of the pharynx posterior to Eustachian tube. The nasal branch supplies mucosa of superior and inferior concha and the posterior ethmoidal sinus, the posterior portion of the nasal septum. It includes the nasopalatine branch. The posterior superior alveolar nerve, it arises from the main trunk in the pterygopalatine fossa and enters the posterior surface of the body of the maxilla. It supplies the 3 upper molar teeth and adjoining part of the gum. The zygomatic nerve, it arises in the pterygopalatine fossa, enters the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure. After entering the zygomatic bone, it gives the terminal branches, that is zygomaticofacial and zygomaticotemporal nerves. The zygomaticofacial nerve appears on the face through foramen in the zygomatic bone and supplies the skin on the prominence of the cheek. And the zygomaticotemporal nerve, it appears in the infratemporal region through the foramen over the zygomatic process. It supplies the skin of the temporal region, gives the communicating branch to the lacrimal nerve. And in the infraorbital canal, the maxillary nerve continues as a infraorbital nerve. So, it emerges on the face through infraorbital foramen. It is accompanied by third part of maxillary artery and the accompanying vein. So, it gives middle superior alveolar nerve that runs along the lateral wall of maxilla and supplies the premolars. And another branch is anterior superior alveolar nerve that runs along the anterior wall of maxilla and supplies upper incisor and canine teeth, maxillary sinus and anterior inferior part of the nasal cavity. The terminal branches are the palpebral nerves, which pierces the orbicularis oculi and supplies the skin of the lower lid. The nasal branches supplies the skin of lateral wall of nose and mobile part of the septum. The superior labial nerve, it forms the infraorbital plexus and supplies the skin and mucous membrane of upper lip, cheek and labial glands. So, to summarize the branches, it is given in the middle cranial fossa, pterygopalatine fossa and the infraorbital fissure. So, in the middle cranial fossa, it gives the meningeal branch. In pterygopalatine fossa, it gives ganglionic branch, posterior superior alveolar branch and the zygomatic branches that will be given the zygomaticofacial and zygomaticotemporal nerves. And in the infraorbital canal, it gives the palpebral nerves, nasal branches, the superior labial nerve. So, diagrammatically we can represent the nerve and its branches like this. Clinical anatomy. The trigeminal neuralgia affecting its maxillary branch produces symptoms in the area of its distributions. So, in that cases we can give the anesthesia of that nerve. The nerve, it can be anesthetized at the foramen rotundum. The maxillary nerve carries the afferent limb fibers of sneeze reflex as it carries the general sensation from the nasal mucous membrane. So, if there is an injury to this maxillary nerve, there will be a loss of sneeze reflex. So, through the infraorbital nerve block, we can anesthetize the area between the lower lid and the upper lip. So, the questions for assignment are the trigeminal ganglion, the divisions of trigeminal nerve, describe the course and branches of the maxillary nerve. Thank you.